All right, let's talk about building bigger biceps here. Which one's better? Is it going to be your bar curls or is it going to be dumbbell curls? Well, this conversation is less about which one is better because the reality is both can work. Both can build muscle. The bigger question is which one's better for you? So the conversation that we're going to have today is about anatomical structure, meaning the way that you're built. Because the reality is we're all built a little bit different. I may be able to do straight bar curls and like them, do them for 20 years without ever injuring myself, build a ton of muscle, but that doesn't mean that you can. Let's talk about some of those differences and some little tests that we can do to figure out which one's going to be a better option for you. So number one is the angle at our elbow. There's a term called valgus, and what valgus refers to is this angle at the elbow, whether our forearm turns out or not. So here's a really simple test. Stick your arm out in front of you. Imagine a dot or a point right in the middle of your shoulder. Draw a line to the middle of your elbow and imagine that line continuing on. Does that line end up in the middle of your hand at your middle finger? If so, that means your arm's relatively straight. You really don't have much valgus at the elbow. If that line ends up at your ring finger, pinky finger, or even outside your hand, that means you have more valgus. So how does that affect whether we use a dumbbell curl or a bar curl? Well, let's imagine that for a second. In a supinated position, let's pretend we're using a straight bar. As we curl up, if we have a lot of valgus, instead of our hand landing in the middle of our shoulder like mine does, this is very natural for me. A lot of people, their hands have a tendency to go outward towards this side, people with more valgus at the elbow. So if they're doing a straight bar curl, a lot of times it's going to be very uncomfortable. If they're trying to really hold that bar tight and keep a strong grip on the bar, as opposed to keeping the bar more loose, which is one way that people compensate, as they curl up, because they're locked in, that bar's not going to give, it's not going to stretch, it's not going to bend. So as their hands have a tendency to want to go out to the outside, the bar doesn't give, so something else is going to feel the pressure. And that's typically going to be at the elbow or the wrist, or like I said, a lot of people will have a tendency to try to compensate in different ways. One way, immediately you'll see them try to grip the bar wider at the beginning of the range of motion. So instead of neutral here, kind of straight from the shoulder down, they'll have a tendency to try to creep out. The other thing that you'll see a lot of times, they curl, they'll let the bar kind of move in their hand, they keep their grip really loose, because they're trying to give themselves more freedom of movement. Or the other way is sometimes you'll see them moving the elbow. If you've got a lot of valgus at the elbow, doing a straight bar curl, probably not going to be your best option. If you really want to do bar curls, that's where an easy bar curl is going to come in. The reason that it's got the bend in the bar is it allows you to have a more neutral hand position, and that's going to make it a little bit more comfortable. My personal preference is dumbbells. Why? Because we have total freedom of movement. We're not doing what we call a closed chain exercise. This is an open chain exercise, and we can move that dumbbell any way we want. The second thing that we want to consider is anatomical structure of our forearm. We can't see it, but we can test it. There's two different things that we need to take into consideration. One is going to be what we call supination, turning our palm up. So the test here is hands at a neutral position. First thing, take note of, where do your hands fall? Do they naturally want to turn where your palms are back? Some people actually have a tendency where their palms face forward a little bit more, or more of a neutral position where palms are literally facing each other. So this is a neutral position. Second thing is, as we supinate, so rotating our palm forward, which is what we do in our biceps curl to get a good strong contraction. So as we supinate, how far can you rotate your hand? For me, I can only rotate where my hand or my thumb points out to the side. Some people are what's called hypersupinators, meaning they can supinate even more. I can exaggerate it by kind of turning my body, but they can turn their hand where the thumb is facing backwards. I can't. I am what you call a hyperpronator, which is the exact opposite. So pronation, from this neutral position, is turning that palm backwards. So a lot of people, as they turn, most of the time they stop right about here, the thumb kind of pointing toward their butt. I can keep rotating around. So how does one or the other affect your curls? Well, depends on the exercise, depends on which piece of equipment we're using. For me, being a hyperpronator, what are the exercises where we pronate our hands? Well, that's going to be our reverse grip curl. So this is a pronated position. Because I'm a hyperpronator, this is actually pretty comfortable for me. So if I'm going to do reverse curls, I don't mind using a straight bar like this. But for me to put my hands in a supinated position, even though I do not have valgus at the elbow, this is a little bit uncomfortable for me. I feel pressure in my elbows when I use a straight bar. So personally, I don't like this for curls. I'll lean towards either dumbbells or even an easy curl bar. Now, someone who is a hypersupinator, doing a straight bar is no problem for them. And that's why you'll hear some people say, well, there's no problem using straight bar curls. There's no risk of injury. Well, maybe for them. And that's the thing. You can't always just take the advice of one person because they may be built different than you. It's the same thing with, say, behind the neck military presses. I can't do it. The way that my shoulders are built, it's very uncomfortable and it puts a lot of stress on them. There's other people that can do it forever, press a lot of weight and have no issue. So those are anatomical considerations that we have to take into consideration when deciding which piece of equipment is best for us or which exercise is best for us. Those are the two main anatomical considerations. Beyond that, pros and cons of one versus the other. Well, at the most basic level with your bars, because you are locked in, because it is a closed chain exercise, you have stability. And because you have stability, it allows you to go heavier. So a lot of people like bar curls versus dumbbells because it allows them to move a lot of weight. It's also more comfortable for a lot of beginners because you have stability, whereas maybe a dumbbell feels a little bit awkward, uncomfortable at first. The big thing around bars, I would say that's the biggest advantage is going to be stability. What's the biggest advantage of a dumbbell? Well, you have more versatility. Because you have freedom of movement, you can do certain exercises that you can't do with a bar. For example, we can do hammer curls where our hand remains in a neutral position the entire time. By putting our hand in a neutral position, we're taking a little bit of the emphasis off the biceps and putting a little bit more on the brachialis, which lies underneath, and the brachioradialis here in the forearm. So that's another advantage of using dumbbells. The other thing is you can do, for example, the way that I like to do my curls, I like to go to a neutral position here at the bottom and get good supination here at the top. Because supination is going to help you get that good, strong contraction in your biceps. So I want to do that, but for me, keeping my hands supinated here at the bottom puts a lot of stress on the elbow. And plus, for a lot of people, it puts a lot of stress on the biceps tendon. So I prefer get good supination at the top and then move to a neutral position at the bottom. I can't do that with a bar. So that's my personal preference. That would be the biggest takeaway is what's going to be best for you and what feels the best, because you need to use a bit of intuition or even common sense, because if something feels awkward, if it's putting pressure on your wrist and it hurts, or it hurts your elbow, or you feel like you just can't keep a good grip on it, well then common sense tells you it's probably not the best exercise for you. Don't try to force it, because this attitude of no pain, no gain doesn't apply to our joints, right? We don't want to feel pain in our joints. So those are the biggest takeaways. It's not that one is better than the other for building muscle. It really comes down to personal preference and also comes down to exercise selection.